It's good for our soul. I am just a singer, sing of every place I go. I am just a singer, every place got a story to be told. I'll just tell them stories, Lordy, every place I go. It's good for my feet, you know it's good for my soul. Here's the chorus, I am just a singer. I am just a singer, I'm a singing on life's road. Sing 'em and a bring 'em. Every place I go, including Socialism in the park. Yeah. We are all just singers, singing on life's road. It's good for our feet. It's good for our soul. Well, you long been on the open road, you've been sleeping in the rain. From the dirt of words, the mud of cells, your clothes are dark and stained. But the dirty words, the muddy cells will one day be judged insane. So only stop and rest yourself till you'll be off again. But why don't you take off your thirsty boots? Stay here for a while. Feet are hot and weary, Lord, from a dusty mile. Oh, maybe I could make you laugh. Maybe I could try. I'm just looking for the evening and the morning in your eyes. In your eyes. In your eyes. Now, tell me of the ones you saw as far as you could see across the town, field to plain, marching to be free. And of the rusted prison gates that tumbled by degree, like laughing children, one by one, they look like you and me. But why don't you take off your thirsty boots? Stay here for a while. Feet are hot and weary, Lord, from a dusty mile. Oh, maybe I could make you laugh. Maybe I could try. I'm just looking for the evening, morning. Your eyes, your eyes, your eyes. Well, I know you are no stranger down the crooked rainbow trails, from dancing cliff edge, shattered cells to slandered shackled jails. But the voices rise up from below as the walls, they're being scaled. Yeah, all of this and more, my friend, your song shall not be failed. But why don't you take off your thirsty boots? Stay for a while. Feet are hot and weary, Lord, from a dusty mile. Well, maybe I could make you laugh. Maybe I could try. I'm just looking for the evening, morning. Your eyes, your eyes, your. I am just a singer. Life's old dusty road. I am just a singer, not much. A voice I'm told, but I'll just keep on singing, Mary, every place I go. It's good for my feet, you know it's good for my soul. Let's bring it home, I am just a singer, I'm a singing on life's road. Sing 'em and a bring 'em. Every place I go, it's we this time. We're all just singers, singing on life's road. It's good for our feet. Yeah, it's good for our soul. Thank you so much. Good to be here, everybody. Thank you for coming.
More seats down in the front. Come on in.
Lots of room. Come on in. I wrote this song back in 1988. And I'm very sad to say that it has as much or more resonance today as it did then. This is a song that, in a way, you would hope would be buried. I'm speaking of my experiences in El Salvador in particular with this song, and I'm speaking in particular about refugees from El Salvador here in Toronto. But really, we're speaking about refugees anywhere. And it's, sadly, conditions are probably worse these days than they were 30 years ago. The song has a very punchy chorus, and feel welcome to jump in and punch away. Chorus is simply hideout, hideout, refugee. You can sing it with power, anger, or whatever other emotion you'd like. In the tiny country of El Salvador, Christianity and its despots kill more. Watch out, soon they'll beat down your door, leave you lying in a pool of blood on the floor. That's in the hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. That's in the hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. That's in the hideout, hideout, refugee. Well, the next thing you know, you leave your own land, try and find yourself a coyote man. The coyote man, he take you across the Rio Grande. It's a hell of a lot easier if you got a couple of grand for the man in his hand, that's in the hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. That's in the hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. That's in the hideout, hideout, refugee. Well, the next thing you know, you're on the bridge in Fort Erie. You're tired, you're tattered, you're torn, and you're weary. And they tell you, you gotta face immigration's inquiry. And your wife and home are back at home, and you worry. It's in the hideout, hideout, refugee. Let me hear you, I said hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee again. Hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. Sounding good. Hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. Well, the next thing you know, you're at immigration, and you're hoping that Canada's a kinder nation. But your hopes are dashed when they begin the interrogation, and you're one step away from deportation. That's in the hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. That's in the hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. That's in the hideout, hideout, refugee, forced to flee. Yes, and hideout, refugee, forced to flee. Said the hideout, refugee, forced to flee. Said the hideout, 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 refugee.
you, Brother Bill. That was phenomenal. So, welcome to Socialism in the Park. I will chair this forum, the second of 3 Wednesday evenings here in Christie Pitts. The topic tonight is permanent revolution. My name is Sam Cheadle. I'm an Ontario Liquor Board employee, OPSU activist, member of the Workers' Action Movement, and on the Central Committee of Socialist Action. So SA is a group of revolutionaries in the Canadian state. We advance the fight for a workers' agenda by building class struggle left wing inside the unions, inside the labor-based NDP, and also work in the international solidarity, and anti-war, anti-poverty, Indigenous peoples, feminist, eco-socialist, and human rights movements. So year-round we host rebel films, concerts, demonstrations, rallies, and conferences. 2 days ago in this park, we confronted Chrystia Freeland in her candidate picnic. I think there was more demonstrators there than actual attendees. Barry might be able to speak to that, but this was over her policy in Venezuela as other human rights crimes perpetrated by the Canadian state through her office. About 50 of us chanted "Lift the blockade" and "Hands off Venezuela," as well as other anti-imperialist slogans, including to do with Palestinian liberation. So we begin by acknowledging the stewardship of this land as being the site of human activity for over 15,000 years as the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca and most recently Mississaugas of the New Credit. The territory was the subject of the Dish One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to be able to live and work in this territory. So tonight's topic, permanent revolution, Stalinism, and a transitional program. Presenter is a leading comrade, a member of SA, and NDP Socialist Caucus and the Workers' Action Movement, Vice President of OPSU Local 532, and a past Executive Board member of OPSU. Please welcome me and join me, my comrade friend, Julius Arkscott.
Thanks very much, Sam. And let's give it up for Bill again. Wasn't that great? So folks, Sam gave a pretty good introduction of what my talk is going to be about. For those of you who've been to events organized by Socialist Action, some of the topics or themes will be familiar, and you may have an easier understanding of what I'm saying. And for those of you who are new, maybe this is the first time you've ever been to one of our events, what my presentation might sound a little bit dense, but I don't want you to feel intimidated or like, you know, this is beyond your periphery or anything like that. There's a long history of working class struggle that most people don't know about. So I'm going to be going into detail about some of that, at least going back to World War I era. So part of the reason why I'm going to go into the history is because it's important for socialists and other fighters for the working class to understand why we are where we are today. How the hell did we get in this freaking mess in the first place? There were great opportunities that presented themselves, but because of political decisions made by different political elements in the time within the workers' movement, it's led us to where we are today, and that's why we need to learn lessons and move forward. So I'll begin. So the outbreak of World War I showed conclusively that capitalism has entered into a period of decline. Enormous material destruction and horrendous human suffering was unleashed. This was repeated through the 20th and 21st centuries. The Great Depression, numerous recessions, colonial wars, destruction of the ecological balance. Humanity is today faced with the stark choice, socialism or barbarism. When war broke out in 1914, the reformist parties of the Socialist International capitulated to the wave of chauvinism and to the ruling class of each big power that went to war. But the contradictions of social patriotism soon erupted. When revolutions finally broke out, the social democratic leaders, who had given their approval to the massacre of millions of soldiers for the cause of capitalist profit, quickly rediscovered their pacifism. They then begged the workers not to use violence to overthrow the system. While the Socialist International fell to pieces, a handful of revolutionary socialists remained faithful to the proletarian internationalism. Folks such as Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, Monat and Rosmera in France, Lenin, a section of the Bolsheviks, Trotsky, Martov in Russia, the SAP in Netherlands, and others such as John Maclean in Great Britain and Eugene Debs, which some of you may have heard of in the United States. and a majority of the social democratic parties in Italy, Serbia, and Bulgaria. The Internationalists regrouped first at the Zimmerwald Conference in 1915, and then at Keinthal in 1916. Lenin predicted a large-scale revolutionary crisis that would bring the radical left to the forefront. He was quite correct. The Russian Revolution broke out in March 1917. In November 1918, revolution broke out in Germany and Austro-Hungary. In 1919-1920, a huge revolutionary upsurge took Italy. At this point, internationalists fought for socialist revolution, and the social patriots became counter-revolutionaries loyal to the state and to capitalism. And remember, the social patriots were the ones who called themselves socialists but supported their ruling classes in going to war during the Great War. In March 1917, Tsarist autocracy fell due to hunger riots and the decomposition of the army. While the 1905 revolution had failed because of the inability of the workers' movement to link up with the peasants' movement, this alliance was achieved, proved fatal for Tsarism in 1917. The working class played the major role in March 1917, but it lacked a revolutionary leadership and was robbed of victory. The power taken from Tsarism was put in the hands of a provisional government, a coalition of bourgeois parties, or parties representing the boss class, like there were groups called the Cadets and moderate labor parties, Mensheviks and other socialist revolutionaries. But the mass movement was so strong that it had its own structure, council of workers, soldiers and peasants, delegates backed up by the armed Red Guards. Thus, from March onwards, Russia was in a situation of dual power. The provisional government was based on a decomposing bourgeois state apparatus. Opposed to it was a network of Soviets, or workers' peasants' councils, progressively constructing a workers' state power. Trotsky predicted in 1905 that Russia's future revolution would see the blossoming of thousands of Soviets was confirmed. The right wing of Russian and international Marxism believed that Russia, being a backward country, needed a bourgeois revolution or a capitalist revolution, like those of the 18th and 19th centuries that happened in other parts of Europe and around the world. What would this entail? The overthrow of absolutism, the winning of democratic rights, freeing the peasants from semi-feudal chains, the liberation of oppressed nationalities, the creation of a unified market to facilitate the rapid growth of industrial capitalism, which would prepare the way for a future socialist revolution. And a similar argument was made by the Stalinists, which I'll talk about later. From this was derived the strategy of an alliance between the liberal bourgeoisie and the workers' movement. The latter force to limit itself to the fight for the 8-hour day, the right to organize and to strike, etc. Lenin rejected this strategy in 1905. He recalled what Marx had said after the revolutions of 1848, and there were major revolutions all across Europe during that time. And he said that once the proletariat appeared on the political scene, the bourgeoisie went over to the camp of counter-revolution out of fear of workers' power. So Lenin proposed an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry. But Lenin conceived of the democratic dictatorship of the workers and peasants as being based upon a capitalist economy and state. As early as 1905-1906, Trotsky pointed to the weakness of this idea. He pointed to the chronic inability of the peasantry to constitute an independent political force. Throughout history, the peasantry has, in the end, always followed a bourgeois or proletarian leadership. With the bourgeoisie going to the right, the fate of the revolution depends on the ability of the proletariat to win political hegemony over the peasant movement and establish an alliance between the workers and peasants under its own leadership. In other words, the Russian Revolution could win and fulfill its tasks only if the proletariat could conquer political power and establish a worker state backed up by an alliance of the poor peasants, so not relying on the boss, on the capitalist class. The theory of permanent revolution therefore proclaims that in the imperialist epoch, or imperialist times, the so-called national or liberal bourgeoisie is in underdeveloped countries is subordinate to foreign imperialism and to the old ruling classes. The tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution can be realized only by the dictatorship of the proletariat, backed by the poor peasants. In other words, only a workers' state could achieve agrarian revolution, national independence, democratic freedoms, and industrial development. Trotsky's prediction in 1906 was entirely confirmed by the course of the Russian Revolution in 1917, and by all of the revolutions in developing countries since then. When Lenin returned to Russia from abroad in spring 1917, he saw the immense revolutionary possibilities. With this April thesis, is what he called, he changed the direction of the Bolshevik Party along the lines of permanent revolution. Some old Bolshevik leaders, including Stalin, Kamenev, and Molotov, resisted. They urged unity with the Mensheviks and critical support for the provisional government, but the Bolsheviks party, under the pressure of vanguard workers, combined with Trotsky's followers, adopted the perspective of permanent revolution and won a majority among the working class masses. After the premature July uprising, the unsuccessful counter-revolutionary push by General Kornilov in August, the Bolsheviks won the majority of the Soviets in the large towns from September onwards. In November, the Petrograd Military Revolutionary Committee, under the leadership of Trotsky, seized power and handed it to the Soviets. The old state and the provisional government collapsed. In the workers' insurrection, violence was minimal. The first worker state was born. The immediate tasks of the revolution were peace, land for the peasants, putting an end to national oppression, and extending Soviet power to vast Russia, across vast Russia. But the bourgeoisie set about to sabotage these policies. The workers, now aware of their strength, would not tolerate this. So what began as workers' control in privately owned firms rapidly passed over into nationalization of the banks, the big factories, and transport system. Except for the peasant and small artisan implements, the major means of production were now in the hands of the people. Still, Russia was a backward country. The Bolsheviks were counting on a revolution in the industrial West, especially in Germany and Italy, which would have created a strong basis for building a classless society. Unfortunately, the German and Italian revolutions did not succeed. This was largely due to the counter-revolutionary role played by the Social Democrats. Isolated, the Russian Revolution, led by Lenin and Trotsky, did the best they could with the available political and material resources that it had. Soviet Russia was torn by civil war. The former landowners and Tsarist officers tried to overthrow the first workers' and peasants' republic by force. The SPD in Germany tried all manner of promises and lies to turn the workers away from the struggle for power, even pledging to nationalize big industry. Nosk called on the Freikorps to beat up leftists, and the Freikorps murdered Rosa Luxemburg. The Freikorps, for those of you who don't know, were the nucleus of the future Nazi armbands. The new communist parties, which founded the Third International, lacked experience and made many errors. The bourgeoisie, fearful of revolution, granted concessions to the workers, including the 8-hour day and universal suffrage. The year 1923 was a turning point. The KPD won a majority of large trade unions. It formed coalition governments in Saxony and Thuringia. But the KPD was badly advised by the Comintern and failed to systematically organize an armed insurrection at the most favorable moment. Big business regained the initiative, stabilized the currency, and brought a bourgeois coalition back into power. The revolutionary crisis was over. Soviet Russia won the Civil War in 1921, but it was exhausted. Production had fallen drastically. Famine gripped the country. To remedy the situation, while waiting for a new rise in the international revolution, Lenin and Trotsky embarked on an economic retreat. Big business would remain publicly owned, but a free market was reestablished for the agricultural surpluses after state taxes. Private land and private small-scale production were allowed. This was the NEP. It was a temporary retreat to stimulate production. The petty bourgeois enriched itself during this period. But a far bigger problem resulting from Russia's backwardness took hold. The proletariat was weakened by the drop in industrial production and the exodus into the countryside. It was partly depoliticized by famine and hardship. Many of its best elements were killed in the Civil War. Those who survived were absorbed into the Soviet apparatus, while the state in this period could not train enough qualified personnel from the working class. The bourgeois intelligentsia tended to retain their monopoly of knowledge. The great poverty favored the defense of material privileges. In 1920, the workers' opposition within the Soviet Communist Party sounded the alarm. In 1921, Lenin called the Russian state a bureaucratically deformed workers' state. In 1923, the Trotskyist left opposition was formed, with the fight against the bureaucracy one of its main priorities. The left opposition called for accelerating the industrialization of Russia, raising wages, increasing democracy in the Soviets and in the party, providing assistance to poor peasants and raising taxes on rich peasants, and reinforcing the perspective of world revolution, including by rectifying our errors of the Comintern. This was a program that could have rescued the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, the majority of leaders understood too late the threat contained in the rise of the bureaucracy. This explains the victory of Stalinism in the USSR. The bureaucracy is not a new class. It is a privileged layer of the working class which usurps power in the Soviet state and economy and used its monopoly of power to grant itself consumer advantages like higher wages, fringe benefits, special shops, etc. It did not own the means of production, and that's very important. Its power rested in the gains of the November Socialist Revolution: public ownership, a planned economy, state monopoly of foreign trade. It was conservative, though. Like every bureaucracy, it put the preservation of its own privileges above the extension of the revolution. It feared world revolution would revive the political activity of the Soviet proletariat and thus undermine its own power. So the bureaucracy favored the international status quo. It resisted the reestablishment of capitalism, but only to a point, which is what occurred in 1989 when the USSR bureaucracy split. Some of these individuals are today now capitalists who were rich by plundering the social wealth. The USSR was not a socialist society, that is, a classless society. It was a society in transition between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism was restored by means of a social counter-revolution. The direct power of the workers could have been restored, but only through a political revolution which could break the bureaucrats' monopoly over the exercise of power. The label capitalist did not apply to the Soviet economy because it was a system where producers were dominated by bureaucrats, not private owners. Capitalism is a specific system of class domination. It is characterized by private ownership of the means of production, competition, generalized commodity production, the transformation of labor power into a commodity, the necessity to sell commodities before the surplus power or surplus value contained in them can be realized, and the inevitability of periodic crisis of generalized overproduction, such as when we have a recession or a depression. None of these could be found in the Soviet economy. Neither was the Soviet economy socialist, which implies a regime of associated producers who themselves regulate their productive and social life, and which is defined by the disappearance of commodity production. The USSR was far from that. Regardless of the claims of the Soviet bureaucracy, the anti-Marxist theory propagated by Joseph Stalin that socialism could be built in one country was simply a crude attempt to justify the bureaucracy and its actions. In opposing socialism in one country, Trotsky and the left opposition did not defend the defeatist position. They were the first to advocate rapid industrialization, the defense of the USSR against imperialism, the defense of the gains of the revolution against any attempt to restore capitalism in the USSR. But they understood that the fate of the USSR depended on the class struggle at an international level. This remains true today for the surviving worker states, for healthy revolutionary Cuba. So then, what is Stalinism? Khrushchev called it a cult of personality. But this psychological explanation is shallow and incompatible with Marxism. Stalinism is the expression of a bureaucratic degeneration of the first worker state, where a privileged social layer usurped power. The forms of brutal repression, such as police terror, the purges, assassinations, and the Moscow trials, can vary, but the main features are constant. Workers' democracy is suppressed in favor of rule by a despotic bureaucracy. In the capitalist world, Stalinism signifies a subordination by the parties which followed the Kremlin at the time of the interests of the socialist revolution in their own countries to the interests of Soviet diplomacy. It debates as Marxist theory into an instrument to justify every tactical turn of the Kremlin and the Stalinist parties. Stalinist tactics have contributed massively to many huge defeats. The coming to power of Hitler in 1933, the defeat of the Spanish Revolution in 1939, the disarming of the French and Italian communist masses, and the reconstruction of the capitalist states and economy in 1944-46, the bloody crushing of the revolutionary movement in Iraq, Indonesia, Brazil, Chile, and many other countries since then. The Stalinist tactics of class collaboration with liberals in the Boss state and in the so-called Popular Front did not help the USSR. They represented the narrow interests of the bureaucracy, and they undermined the workers' interests everywhere and the very existence of the USSR. By the 1940s, the USSR ceased to be an underdeveloped country. A new rise of world revolution led to the emergence of new worker states in Yugoslavia, China, Vietnam, and Cuba, and radicalization of youth in Western Europe and the Americas. Under these conditions, opposition tendencies arose and splits within the Stalinist bureaucracies occurred, such as the Stalin-Tito rupture in 1948 and October-November 1956 uprising in Hungary, the Prague Spring in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and revolts in Poland in the 50s and later. After Stalin's death, a series of reforms were implemented in agriculture and industry, but these were limited in their effect by the continuing stranglehold of the bureaucracy. Without the democratic and public control by the mass of producers and consumers, it is impossible to achieve truly rational and efficient production that also meets the desires of the population. Each bureaucratic reform tends to substitute a new form of bureaucratic abuse and waste. Greater autonomy of workers' managers, combined with technological delays and overcommitment to military expenditures, resulted in a general stagnation in the 70s that doomed the USSR. The victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 broke the capitalist encirclement of the USSR, stimulating the process of permanent revolution in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and put imperialism on the defensive. This occurred because, in practice, the Maoist leadership broke with the Stalinist line of the bloc of four classes, is what it was termed, and revolution by stages. It led a vast peasant uprising and destroyed the bourgeois state. However, the Chinese Revolution was bureaucratically deformed from the outset. The independent activity of the working class was restricted. Forms of bureaucratic privilege, imitating Soviet Russia, were widespread. Mao tried to channel growing mass discontent by launching the so-called Cultural Revolution in 1964-65. But this was essentially a campaign to purge Mao's enemies in the Communist Party apparatus. When the Red Guards became critical of the entire bureaucracy, they were dissolved. The Sino-Soviet split reflected the Chinese Communist Party's rejection of monolithic control by Moscow, which was justified. But the narrow nationalism employed by both sides of the dispute, later duplicated in the China-Vietnam split, dealt a severe blow to the international workers' movement and gave imperialism more space to maneuver. Maoism is a more flexible, eclectic offshoot of original Stalinism in Russia. Its characterization of the USSR as social imperialist served to justify all of the turns in Chinese foreign policy, including alliances with the bourgeoisie in various countries and a so-called struggle for independence for the two superpowers. It substitutes Maoist ideology for fundamental class distinctions. It rejects workers' democracy. It rejects the United Front, and it justifies the use of violence and repression with the workers' movement. Behind a veneer of mass participation, it paved the way for capitalist restoration in China today. Since World War I, the objective conditions for building a socialist society have existed. The world division of labor and the interdependence of peoples reached a high level. The numerical strength of the working class and the economic basis for transforming the world economy is present. Political conditions necessary for revolution, including growing divisions within the bourgeoisie, its inability to rule, and growing rebellion against the system by workers, has risen periodically in various countries. Lacking, however, were adequate subjective conditions. These include the level of class consciousness of the proletariat, its degree of maturity, and the strength of its revolutionary leadership, that is, its revolutionary party. Therefore, the lack of revolutionary victories, particularly in the West, has been essentially a function of the crisis of leadership in the working class. This analysis, based on the historic failures of reformism and Stalinism, led Trotsky and opposition communists in 1933 to begin creating a new revolutionary leadership for the world working class. In 1938, they established the Fourth International for this purpose. The construction of new revolutionary parties and a new international combines the defense of the Marxist program, which brings together all of the lessons of past class struggles, with a current action program that integrates what Trotsky called a program of transitional demands. Socialists intervene in mass struggles to bring the participants through their experience to the acceptance of the action program and to give forms of organization to these struggles, which will teach them to create workers' councils during revolutionary crisis. The need for revolutionary international has a material basis: world economy, world politics, and world wars. Imperialism is a global system. Production is global. The great problems of humanity can be resolved only on a world scale. It is utopian to proceed on any other basis. To put off the creation of a real mass revolutionary international, the member revolutionary parties in each country is to lag behind the objective needs of our epoch and the advanced sections of the masses themselves. What is the distinction between immediate demands and transitional demands? By themselves, working people generally do not go beyond the formulation of a more immediate aims, such as higher wages, shorter hours, basic democratic rights. These are demands that the bourgeoisie can grant to prevent struggles from threatening capitalism as a whole. And these are struggles that we should pursue, but they're not goals that are going to win to get rid of the capitalist system. Besides, higher wages can be neutralized by higher prices, and shorter hours can be countered by stepping up the pace of work. The state can raise taxes to force workers to pay for social gains they win. To break this vicious cycle, working people must be won to the adoption of transitional demands, demands which are increasingly incompatible with the normal functioning of the capitalist economy and state. Transitional demands must be easily understood, while at the same time unleashing a challenge to the system and promote self-organization of the masses. Examples for a sliding scale of wages and hours, open the books, and demand for workers' control. The transitional program also addresses the reality of the three sectors of the world revolution today. In the semi-colonial countries, workers must support every anti-imperialist mass movement, whether it is aimed against foreign domination, for a peasant revolution, or for the elimination of a local bloody dictatorship. Having won the leadership of the mass movement, the proletarian fights for the conquest of power. It seeks to overthrow both the foreign and native bourgeoisie. This is a strategy of permanent revolution. In the bureaucratized worker states, we fight for democratic freedoms, against corruption, against the reappearance of national oppression, and demand the running of worker states by the workers themselves, organized in councils with a plurality of parties, free debate in the media, and a democratically planned economy through democratically centralized workers' councils. This is a strategy of political anti-bureaucratic revolution. In the imperialist countries, the mass movements confront capitalist exploitation and the suppression of democratic freedoms. The fight for a new revolutionary leadership leads to the overthrow of capital and its state, and towards collective ownership of the means of production and socialist planning. This is a strategy of the socialist revolution and the proletariat. The different tasks of workers and revolutionaries around the world reflect the uneven and combined development of the world revolution. This revolution does not break out simultaneously in all countries. The supreme task of revolutionary socialists is the progressive unification of all revolutionary processes into one. This unification is possible because one social class is capable of advancing it everywhere. This unification will take place thanks to the internationalist politics and education of the revolutionary vanguard, which will increasingly bring to bear experiences of international solidarity, in which we'll systematically fight racism, sexism, heterosexism, and national chauvinism.
Yeah, right on.
The direct action of the masses through strikes and other mobilizations raises their level of consciousness through the growth of confidence in themselves. In daily life, workers, poor peasants, small artisans, women, youth, national, and racial minorities are accustomed to being crushed, exploited, and oppressed. They tend to feel that revolt is useless, that their enemies are too strong. But in the heat of great struggles, these feelings of inferiority begin to disappear. Ordinary people become aware of their immense potential power as soon as they take collective action. That is why revolutionary Marxists attach extreme importance to everything that increases the self-confidence of the masses and helps to break them from servile behavior. For that reason, we emphasize democratic assemblies of strikers electing strike committees and every similar mechanism and other forms of mass action. In learning to conduct our own struggles today, we learn how to run the state and the economy for tomorrow. Unity in action is crucial as well, because unity cannot be achieved without practicing the widest possible workers' democracy. Unity means non-exclusion of any current that participates in the struggle and freedom of expression within the struggle. It also means minorities should respect majority decisions, knowing they will have an opportunity to modify decisions in the light of experience and through further debates and votes. So I will conclude with just two more points. First, as an example of the application of the method of the transitional program to conditions in the Canadian state today, I refer you to the booklet Prospects for Socialism in Canada, which you can find over on the table there, and the action platform for Workers' Agenda, which you can also find on there. And we have a lot of actually excellent booklets on that table, so check it out afterwards. You'll also find it useful to read the Manifesto for Socialist Canada, the platform for the NDP Socialist Caucus. Secondly, I strongly suggest that a revolutionary program incorporating transitional, democratic, and defensive demands is of little use without a democratically centralized revolutionary organization that educates, agitates, and organizes for its realization. I invite everyone here who wants to fight for a better world to take the most important step forward you can in that direction. Join Socialist Action today. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Julius. That was excellent. We see these struggles in hindsight 2020 when we see where Germany almost went red at a certain point, which would have opened up the door for Soviets across Europe, into the UK, into Chicago, and it could have changed the course of world history. So the point is not to miss another window and the tasks that go into that. So before I open the floor to questions, I want to share some info. The July edition of SA newspaper, best socialist newspaper in North America.
Most struggles are unwinnable under capitalism. The women's struggle, feminism, the struggle for native rights, the struggle for gay people. They can start winning some things under capitalism, but to really win the struggle for these things, it takes socialism. And so people can only go so far under capitalism for these struggles.
Thank you, Judy. And we're seeing how a lot of the floors are these rights and freedoms are not only at the end of the road under our current system, but a lot are being rolled back as well. In which a situation comes out where we're rapidly losing ground, right? We're losing the battle along a lot of these struggles that we held to be sacrosanct, whether it's women's reproductive rights or decent work or housing. All of these things have been rapidly rolled back. Can I, any other, who's next? Can I get any other speakers? Corey.
It was a great talk, Julius. I'm Corey David, I'm a member of Socialist Action, and I'm a machinist up in Vaughan. Anyways, I just wanted to talk a little bit about permanent revolution and how important permanent revolution is, that concept. Because as we see, like we've had sort of social democrats relatively in power in Europe and in North America for some time. You think of like Roosevelt and the New Deal, and they put out a lot of reforms that improve the lives of working people. But if we don't gain, workers' power or a worker state or emancipation from capitalism, all those things can be taken away. And so it's really important to consider that when we consider our philosophy or our program, our orientation towards politics, is that we need to be making sure that we fight for a worker state and that we fight for workers' power, and democratic control over all of society, not just one vote in one election every year, or every 2 years, or whatever it is, but democracy of the workplace, democracy of the home, democracy of the what do they call it, the community, what do they call it, the public, I don't know, the commons, the democratic control of the commons. You know, we're losing the commons. We're here in this commons right now, and this is a beautiful place. But all across the world, we're losing the commons to private property. And we need to make sure that that doesn't happen, that we don't allow, that we don't even put people in power that will sell off private property, you know. So I just want people to consider that. This isn't necessarily the most well put together advocacy for a permanent revolution, but I think it's extremely important to talk about that, and to not just to look for reform to solve our problems. That we need to take power ourselves, you know, and take control for ourselves, you know, not just as one person, but as the whole of society of this world. Anyways, that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Corey. Anybody else before I get the mic back to Julius for a minute? Any other critical questions, points on the presentation? Anything you disagreed with, maybe? Or about how history unfolded? Yes, sister. All comments, welcome.
It's just a question. It's not really a comment. Thank you. I enjoyed the talk. I'm just curious, how can we mass mobilize? You know, I've been to many different demonstrations with many different communities, and so I'm just wondering what's in the mix, what's in the future, and how can we get involved?
That's an point.
Okay, I think I'm going to start with that one first, because it's the best one. All the other were great contributions, but that is kind of the question of the day, isn't it, right? With this Doug Ford government and all the major crises that we're facing, ecological crisis, the crisis of the rise of the alt-right, the stagnation of wages, all of these things are happening, and it's clear that the economic system that there's major problems, and a lot of people are starting to ask questions, even if they don't necessarily identify it as capitalism and as the answer as socialism. A lot of people more and more see that there's a major problem. What I would say is part of the problem actually is the bureaucracy in the existing workers' movement. In the New Democratic Party, which is a labor party, and in our labor unions, there is an existing bureaucracy that exists, which, similar to the Stalinist bureaucracy, serves its own role as essentially as self-preservation. So they're not interested in mass action, really. I mean, if mass action if there was an upsurge, if the students were good to go on strike, for instance, you often hear labor bureaucrats who have access to millions and millions of dollars point to the students and say, we're going to wait for them to do something. It's much less of a threat than encouraging mass action within our own unions, because essentially what happens is that as the workers' state exists today, most people are not engaged in the workers' movement, right? And even most people who are unionized don't participate in their unions. And that serves the bureaucracy just fine. In order to have the kind of mass movement that you want, it helps a lot for the organized wings of the workers' movement, the Labor Party, and labor unions in particular, to support those actions. They have the resources to do that. They have the connections, the contacts. But in order to do that, you really have to open up democracy within those bodies, and they don't want to put their privileged positions under threat. And that's a problem. I'm a former executive board member of my union, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, and I was representing the Toronto region. And I was pushing for mass action and the idea of a general strike. And the response that you get from the bureaucracy is just excuse after excuse. Well, let's look at, they want to depend on other elements such as students to get things going. And I think that while we should definitely applaud when the students stand up, it's very inspiring, we can't just rely on our kids to take care of the crisis that we're facing. Like it's a crazy excuse to do nothing. But things are in flux, and part of the role that we in Socialist Action work that we do is we challenge the bureaucracy in the NDP and the bureaucracy in the labor unions as well. And so just to give you an example, we work in the Workers' Action Movement. I ran for the executive position within my union. I ran on a socialist platform, very clear socialist platform, fighting concessions, bargaining for union democracy and for workers' power. And I ended up winning with those ideas. So the ideas that we talk about, that socialists talk about, are more popular than most people believe. It's part of the reason why we're doing this event in this very public space where anybody can walk by. It's not in some academic institution. The ideas for socialism are more popular today than they have been in decades. But we have to be more engaged within the workers' movement. There needs to be more socialists engaged in challenging the status quo in the workers' movement. Part of the reason why I went into this talk, and it is a very dense talk. I mean, people write volumes and volumes of text about the issues that I just mentioned in this talk. But you know, we're not taught about working class struggle, the history of working class struggle, right? We were not taught this in schools. Most people had no idea. You know, myself included, when I joined the socialist movement about a decade ago, I didn't really have much of an idea. I'd heard of the Russian Revolution, but mostly my concepts and ideas of socialism were pretty negative. You know, it was reinforced by the corporate media and the society that we live in. But when I started reading Marx and I started thinking about the ideas that he talked about, they actually made a lot of sense to me. And anyway, that's what we're doing, is we're trying to get the ideas out there. And as I said, you know, we need to be organized. We need to be organized in challenging the status quo within the workers' movement, and we need to be organized in building a revolutionary party, because when the time comes, and we can't make the time will present itself. The idea is that we are ready for that when it happens. Oh, one last thing, and I encourage anyone to ask any questions or make any comments that they have. I wanted to plug this article that has been published in Maclean's magazine. Our very own John Wilson, a member of Socialist Action, was a leader in the queer liberation movement in the 1970s. John was interviewed about his action that he participated in 1971. And I think this is part of a larger list of interviews of that period. So if you don't have one of these, I think there was a few that were handed out. Check it out. We might have a few more, or you can pick up a copy of Maclean's. But he does a great shout out for Black Lives Matter and the rejection of police at Pride, which is great. So fantastic. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. Any other questions or comments?